Today I'm going to be replacing this shaker door made from solid wood the correct way out of MDF. Now, bear with me, there is a reason behind this madness. First of all, this is made from cheap pine from the big box store, and surprise, surprise, it has warped, probably because it wasn't dried properly in the first place. So the door needs to be replaced, and there's also, if you're ever designing a cupboard door like this as well, there's a bit of a quirk that you need to do up here to make it fit, which I'll explain later on in the video. So let's get the door off. For those of you that don't know, a traditional shaker door is made up of 5 primary elements. On the verticals you've got the stiles, on the horizontals you've got the rails, and in the middle you've got the panel. Now there's lots of different variations on this theme, and this is about as basic as you get, but it does make it quite a good illustration of how it's done. Now with 18mm on the perimeter and 6 in the center, I need to cut a 6mm groove to accommodate that panel around the inside perimeter. And when I cut that, I go all the way down to the edges, which then I cut a corresponding tongue onto the end of the rails so that these two can slot together. And that, by the way, is why you have that giveaway detail on the tops and bottoms of your door that shows that it's made the traditional way. When you assemble that, you only glue these joints. You don't glue the panel in place. That should actually be floating with a little bit of movement so that as the wood expands and contracts through the seasons, it's allowed to move and it doesn't warp your door. At least you hope so. Now, I said I'm gonna make this out of MDF, and that is the plan, but I'm not gonna be doing it the traditional way. I'm gonna be making it as simple as possible for myself.
We're fortunate that we have the old door that we can use as a template. We just lie it down on the 12mm MDF and trace it out. The old door had about a 3mm clearance around the perimeter, which gives us a little bit of wiggle room when tracing and cutting out. Though we want to be as accurate as possible because we want to maintain that consistent border. We can then whip out the track saw, and soon enough we have a door. To create the shaker door effect, we're going to use 6mm MDF cut to 100mm wide. To give ourselves a guide to work from, we're going to draw a line 100mm offset from all the edges. We then lay out all our pieces and mark them up so that we can cut the angles. You'll notice that we run the vertical stiles long and the horizontal rails short, just like a genuine shaker door. As it would be near impossible to get the 6mm MDF to match the 12mm MDF shape, we're going to bias our marks so that when we put it all together, the 6mm slightly overhangs the 12. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, it will all make sense shortly. The top of our door needs to match the angle of our staircase, which unfortunately isn't a nice number, so we use the sliding bevel to capture that angle and mark it onto the timber. Then, without adjusting the bevel, we also use it to set up the miter saw. At this point you really need to mark up your faces so you know which is the top surface and where it's going to be located. Because the next job is to apply a chamfer to the inside edges only. We'll use a chamfer bit here to create a 3mm chamfer. Some of the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed the custom vacuum attachment. This was a prototype that we were developing at the time and have now finalised. Having the vacuum attachment makes a huge difference to the dust in the workshop, but we found the stock attachment so fiddly to install and blocks the sight of the cutter. So we made this simple 3D printable model that clicks into place and where you can see what you're doing. If you'd like one, you can purchase the STL files from our store so that you can print one for yourself. There's a link down below. Unfortunately, we're not equipped to sell the physical models, but if you don't have a 3D printer, there's loads of places that would be happy to print it for you. Just Google online 3D printing and upload the files. And then we glue it all up. Again, we were really careful here to make sure the 6mm was overhanging the 12mm just a little bit. And a little bit of foreshadowing here. You might notice that the 6mm and 12mm are quite different colours. Now that might be because we sourced them from different people at different times, but more likely it's because the 12mm had been kicking around the workshop for some time and had probably absorbed a little bit of moisture. And that does come back to bite us later on when we come to paint. With the glue dry and the clamps removed, you can see that slight overstep on the 6mm. A flush trim router bit will make short work of tidying that up. And then our second router still has the chamfer bit set to the same height, so we run that around the perimeter. The first time we built a sloped door like this and went to install it, it wouldn't fit. The top edge of the door actually fouls on the angle of the frame, something we hadn't seen coming but is rather obvious in hindsight. What we need to do to fix this is actually put a tapered chamfer on that top corner of the door so that it can then fit in, and as the door closes, the chamfer just sort of melts into the frame.
So I've got the top of the door here, and I want to add a tapered chamfer to the underside, starting here and then disappearing around about here. Now I've had a good think about this, and I think the best way for me to do this will be using a track saw with the saw set to 45 degrees, and if I tilt the track round over here, that should give me the taper that I need. So if I measure the thickness of the door, I've actually ended up with a 19mm thick door with a chamfer depth of 3mm. So I want my chamfer to start just below there. So I need to offset here 3mm, and then around about here I need to offset 19mm, or call it 20 just to be safe. So I 3D printed this little jig, which I can put in place there, and then line up my track to that jig, clamp it all down, remove the jig, and then I should be able to run the saw and get the perfect tapered chamfer.
And there we have it, a chamfered top corner. I'm not sure if this is the way the professionals do it, but it seems to work well for us. For the hinges, no need to break out a tape measure, just bring in the old door, put it on top and project the hinge locations down. If you don't have an old door like us, you'll need to measure out the location for the hinges onto the door, and then use a story stick to transfer those hinge locations onto the door frame. For the hinge recesses, we used a chisel to mark the boundaries and then a router to remove the bulk of the material. It was at this point we realised that the 12mm MDF was really very soft, which is going to cause us problems with the hinge screws as well as when painting.
And as if by magic, the door is now suddenly painted. Now, I filmed this whole process, and I was intending to make that part of this video, but upon reflection, I think I want to keep this video concise, keep about the build process, and I'm going to edit a separate video on how to finish MDF, because I was experimenting with sealer, primer, paint, and I got some interesting results. So if you're interested in that, there's a link down in the description below, but for now, let's get the handle attached and then brought into the house.
We just went for a simple handle that needed a single hole, and we brought out the drill guide here because there's nothing worse than having a wonky hole and wonky handle at the end of a project. Apart from being a little bit fiddly due to the small hinges, attaching the door was as straightforward as it gets, which you'd hope given we had a first door to work from. And to hold the door shut, we used one of these magnetic latches. The easiest way to fit these is from inside the cupboard.
Done. That's about as easy a shaker door as I think you're ever going to get. And the results speak for themselves. I think they look great. If you are interested in the paint video, then please do check that out. And until next time, Cheerio.